everybody, we're back and we're on chapter 22, Psychosocial Development in Adulthood. All right, our final chapter of adulthood. Okay, so psychosocial development, let's talk a little bit about that normative crisis approach that we talked about in childhood in particular. Carl Jung was one of the psychoanalytic theorists who took this normative crisis approach angle. He emphasized a quest for meaning in life. I don't think I really mentioned Jung before. He was one of Freud's followers. He was a psychoanalytic theorist. And one of the ways that he diverged from Freud and actually ended up getting in a big fight with Freud and not being friends anymore was that Jung thought that instead of being motivated by these psychosexual things that Freud thought was so important, was that instead we were driven by trying to figure out why we're here and trying to figure out who we are. Really, those are our tasks, he thought. And so he thought one of the biggest transitions of our lives is the midlife transition. He said, prior to age 40, we have a lot of obligations that we're focused on. We are trying to get settled in a career. We're trying to find a mate. We're trying to raise our children, things like that. And he said, so we're so focused on those things prior to the age of 40 that it causes us to express certain characteristics that are consistent with our sex. So, for example, he said that in the pursuit of our obligations, females would emphasize expressiveness and nurturance in their personality more, and that males would emphasize achievement in their personality more. That those types of personality traits, us expressing those things, help us to achieve our different goals that males and females might have. He thought that once our careers are established and our children are grown, it kind of frees us up to really start focusing on our inner selves. And he says, in fact, our job in life is to focus on our inner self at this point. After we've done our jobs, our obligations, now we have to start figuring out how to be our true, authentic selves. Oops, I'm going the wrong direction. Okay. One of the big jobs of acknowledging ourselves is to acknowledge that we're here for a finite period of time, and so we need to start achieving our full goals, our full purpose. So he said that in midlife, oftentimes we'll see that people will become more comfortable expressing the other side of their personality that they might have been sort of keeping under wraps up until this point. So now after 40, he thinks males can start being more expressive and nurturing, and females can start pursuing achievement more fully. He thought that we have with us all the time sort of what he calls the persona and the shadow. And the persona is what we want to put out to everybody else and have everybody else think that that's really what we're like. And we try and hide our shadow. We don't want people to think we're these bad things that we're embarrassed of or we don't like about ourselves. And he says as we get into midlife, it's contingent on us to start acknowledging our shadow side and start to embrace it. It's part of us. And so he really thought that healthiness and happy adulthood would be, bringing together of our multiple sides, our masculine and our feminine, our persona and our shadow, all the different things that he talked about. If you find this at all interesting, which a lot of college students really like Jung's ideas, because he's got this sort of, yin and yang concept that he really follows. You might enjoy reading that during your break from school. It's kind of a fun read. Erikson's another psychoanalytic theorist who we've talked about before in his psychosocial stages. So I'm going to pick up with adolescence because I just got done talking about, this midlife crisis transition thing that Jung was talking about. That sounds a lot like what Erikson says we go through in adolescence, doesn't it? That we're trying to figure out who we are and we're trying to see ourselves as unique and integrated, right? That we're integrated would be another way of saying bringing our different disparate parts of ourselves together and making a whole, right? So Erikson thought we did that in adolescence, and that in early adulthood, which he would include the 25 to probably 45 range, he says our big job during this period is to develop intimacy or risk isolation. That our job is to make a commitment to other people, to find somebody to love and invest in, form an affectionate relationship, And really, he said the virtue that we develop during this period of time is the ability to love. So early adulthood is devoted to finding a mate, he thought. He thought that's how you find intimacy. He wouldn't say friends, fit, or whatever. He would say you have to find a mate, because then that sets you up really well for the next stage. And it's called middle age in his terminology, but he thought really 30 to 60 would be this, where you're pursuing generativity. According to Erikson, the easiest way to be generative is to make some kids and raise some children. And if you can't make kids, adopt some children or mentor some children or something like that. He thought that, putting a mark on the future generations would be the best way. But he said there's other things that we can do that would leave our mark on society, other generative things we could do, devote our time to causes, help groom hiking trails, different kinds of things could satisfy the generativity need. He said that if we don't do that, we run the risk of falling into self-absorption, where we're worried just about ourselves, about us and how we're doing, whether we have enough stuff, things like that. So he says that's the big risk we run in middle age. If we satisfy the demand on the side of generativity, then we develop the virtue of care. We can care about someone else besides ourselves. Now, in the aging years, which he called, in his terminology, 60 and above, he says our big psychosocial conflict is between integrity versus despair. And he said that a sense of integrity comes from being able to look back on our lives with a sense of fulfillment, pride, that we did the best we could, that overall we lived a life well lived, and that kind of thing. If, on the other hand, we look back and say, oh my gosh, if only I could have done it again, everything would have been better, I made so many mistakes and I just wish I could fix them, that kind of thing, he says that we end up in despair. And really, he, like Erikson, Jung, thought that one of the big jobs of adulthood is to recognize that we're only here for a period of time, and that we need to be able to integrate what we've done and feel good about it. He says that if we solve this conflict on the side of integrity, then we get the virtue of wisdom, so that we can help guide the next generation through the lens of what we've learned and what we know, thanks to the things that we've been through. So I thought I'd finish up this segment by talking a little bit about the midlife crisis. Here we have a CEO going through a midlife crisis. I'm beginning to feel a genuine concern for my employees. I put midlife crisis with a question mark because is there such a thing as a midlife crisis? Here's a nice stereotype. I like that the guy is shirtless in his convertible. So here he is. I'm going to guess this man is midlife. I don't know him. And he's gone out and bought his sports car. All he has to do is put his new trophy wife in the right side seat, and we've fulfilled all the stereotypes, right, of a man going through a midlife crisis. Is this really a thing? Well, according to people who were popular authors when I was a child, the answer is a screaming yes. Here we have Gail Sheehy. She wrote a book called Passages, talking about the midlife crisis. That came out in 1977. In 1978, Daniel Levinson came out with a book called The Season of a Man's Life, because now really Gail Sheehy was targeting women, and so Daniel Levinson was targeting men and their midlife crisis. And then Sally Conway decided to be a little bit more integrative, and she wrote You and Your Husband's Midlife Crisis, obviously targeting women, but acknowledging maybe that both sexes would go through a midlife crisis. Really, there's no scientific evidence of such a thing as a midlife crisis. One thing that researchers have found is that people who have experienced crises throughout their lives are more likely to experience a crisis in midlife. So people who found adolescence to be particularly turbulent, had a lot of discord, a lot of arguments and things like that, are more likely as adults to have crises when they become parents, to have crises at work, to have crises at midlife. So it may just be that some people are more prone to this kind of reaction, where they feel like everything needs to change and everything is wrong and everything everything seems up in the air. Now, I wanted to juxtapose the adolescence identity struggle on the previous slide with our conversation about adulthood, because one of the things that modern psychologists are starting to notice is that really there are several times in our lives when we have to kind of redefine ourselves. I don't really want to say that it's a crisis, but there are periods of time when big things are changing, big life alterations are going to occur, and a person sort of has to figure out, what does this mean for me? How does this fit into my identity and how I see myself? And then adjust, right? Like when a person goes from living with their parents to not living with their parents, that's going to be an adjustment. Like, how much do I rely on my parents? How much am I supposed to stand on my own 2 feet? What do I want to do next? I mean, like, there's all these questions involved in that. And we may not think them overtly the way I just phrased that, but it's something we all go through. When a person becomes a parent, all of a sudden they're thrust into a new status. They're now in charge of another person's life, and they get to decide things for them. And it's a big change. It can be stressful. And then when those little people grow up and leave the house, okay, I've been taking care of these people for 18 years or however long I've been taking care of these people. Now what do I do with my time? What am I supposed to do now? And it's not necessarily a crisis. It's just sort of okay, I get to reevaluate. I get to sort of figure out, okay, now given that I don't have to do that stuff anymore, my obligations have passed, as Jung said, now what do I want to do with this time? Or what is my new obligation? So for a lot of modern researchers, they're saying that this kind of sort of reassessing happens multiple times. It'll probably happen again at retirement when a person realizes they're not going to be doing this anymore, and so they now get to do that, or they should do this, or right? They go through this set of questioning, and that's really normal and shouldn't necessarily be viewed as a crisis. All right, let's stop here, and we will move on the next segment into marriage.